World War One, World War Two, and the Commonwealth contribution. Lots of people have no doubt heard in the news during this week that the British government were saying that they failed to commemorate effectively the contribution of the Commonwealth troops. That's the troops that were from the Commonwealth who fought in World War One and World War Two. And they have admitted that they failed to commemorate those soldiers correctly. A really sad scenario when you think about it, because so many people lost their lives. I think the figure was 116,000 people in World War One lost their lives from the Commonwealth troops, and it is an historic sort of moment that the government's actually recognising that contribution and wants to rectify what actually happened and what's happened subsequent to that, to actually commemorate those soldiers correctly in the manner that they deserve. We're joined by some special guests this morning. Dr. Irfan Malik, are you on Zoom? Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Morning, Dr. Malik. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's a bit of a dull day here in Leicester. How's Ramzan going? It's day 11 for you, or day 12?
Day 12, yes. Alhamdulillah, it's going very well, thank you.
Great. I was just working it out this morning. That's 40% of Ramzan done already. It's going very, very quickly. So, mashallah, everybody's doing really well. And it's strange because by now you get used to fasting, don't you? Almost, and it's not so difficult as it was at the start. All of a sudden, you stop eating. But as you get to about day 10, 12, 13 onwards, it seems to be a routine almost.
Absolutely, we're getting all used to it now.
Excellent. You're listening to Radio Ramadan 87.9 FM. Our telephone number is 0116 4822 If you want to call in, please call in and listen any questions that you might have regarding the show, or you can send us a WhatsApp message, and our number is 0774 8855 So our WhatsApp number is 0774 8855 Dr. Malik, I just wanted to ask you, because I know of your background. How have you been involved in celebrating the Commonwealth contribution, and what was it particularly that drew you into looking back at history and looking at what was actually happening, and what was the first sort of point that you realised how your involvement of your family or your village was?
Yes, thank you. So my journey started 7 years ago in 2014. I'm not a historian at all, so I sort of fell into this interest. But at that time, it was a centenary of the beginning of World War One, and there was a lot in the news in Britain about soldiers on the Western Front and celebrating their contributions. And I knew that my village, Dulmial, from Punjab in present-day Pakistan, had a strong military history as well. So I decided to research my particular family history, and found out that both of my great-grandfathers, Captain Ghulam Muhammad and Subedar Muhammad Khan, were part of World War One as well. So slowly, I had contacts in the village, a local historian there. We collected archive data and photographs, and we started to connect the history from undivided India to Britain. Up until that time, I couldn't really connect the two. And this small dusty village of Dulmial provided 460 soldiers for the Great War, which was a record for any village in South Asia. And this was rewarded with a British cannon in 1925, and also a memorial plaque in the village. So slowly, this story began to build. I had photographs of my great-grandfathers in military uniform and their medals. And I started to collect the archives, collect the photographs and the story as well, and put it together in a blog together with some assistance from the Hidden Histories Centre at the University of Nottingham. And after that first blog, this story sort of avalanched and got bigger and bigger. And then more people in Britain and England and the mainstream media became interested in this narrative of the story of the forgotten soldiers of undivided India. And as we know, in World War I, 1.5 million soldiers from undivided India contributed, and out of them, 400,000 were Muslims. So it was a very positive narrative for Muslims and also all soldiers from the Indian subcontinent. So that's how my interest developed 7 years ago. And now, I'm a public speaker on our village of Dulmial. And I travel up and down the country talking to a wide variety of audiences. And they are all surprised at the level of input that, present day Pakistan, Bangladesh, India gave, fighting for the British Empire, because King George V was the head of India at that time. So that's how my journey started.
Excellent. Thank you very much. But there was lots of other countries, African countries, the Caribbean, lots of contribution from across the Commonwealth, over 50 countries involved. And, it was a huge contribution, a huge contribution that people made. And I just wanted to sort of ask you, your village made a huge sacrifice. They spilled blood for this country, and, they built part of this country in a little dusty village in the middle of Pakistan.
Absolutely. And, I was born and brought up in Nottingham, and in history lessons or when I saw films about World War or literature, I never saw, a black soldier or an Asian soldier. So it was a very much, I assumed that it was a white war. And we never saw any representations from any of these countries around the world that helped, the Allies in the First World War.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to come back to you again, Irfan Malik, but we're going to go to our another guest speaker, Jahan Mahmood, who's a historian, expert in this field. He's been written sort of extensively on this. He's done a lot of work, has his own museum. I cannot say how much work he's done. I'm really grateful for him to have done so much work on this, because it really does make a huge difference about helping educate masses of people about our contribution. Good morning to you, Jahan Mahmood, and thank you very much for joining us. Jahan?
Hi, good morning.
Yeah, fine, thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much. Yeah, good morning, Jahan. Thank you very much for joining us. Jahan, can you? Thank you very much. Can you first of all go back and tell us, how was the involvement first started? How did the British government of the day, or the British Empire of the day, get involved in the actual start of World War One?
I think Jahan's internet
Technical
is playing.
Okay, we'll go to Dr. Malik. Dr. Malik, how did you find this? Dr. Malik, how did you?
Yes.
Do you know anything about how the start of the involvement was?
What of the Indian contribution?
How did they start recruiting troops in your village when they first started originally? And
well, actually, from our village's situation, the history even goes back hundreds of years. It's always been a military village. And when we looked at archived letters from Dulmial, we found out that even going back to the time of the Indian Mutiny in 1857, that soldiers from Dulmial had, served with the British to defend against the mutiny. So by the time the First World War happened, the British had a relationship with our village and used the elders of the village to recruit from that particular village. And the retired veterans actually, used to train and recruit the youngsters. So they already had built up a relationship with our village and also, hundreds of other villages as well. And then, going to the martial races theories, there were particular races that they preferred for certain regiments.
Yes, and what made your village, so many people in your village actually join the British Army at that time? What was the real driver for that? Was it the finances? Was it just part of their heritage, or they wanted to be part of that?
I think going back hundreds of years, that it was always a warrior village, a military village. And at the time of World War I, 460 men served, and there were only about 850 males in the village, including boys and elders as well. So basically, every able-bodied man in the village joined the army. That I suppose you see your neighbors, what they're doing, and you want to do better than them in the field that they're doing. And, this was the main occupation for this village, even up till, Second World War, and then later on in the Pakistan Army as well. Obviously, now things have changed and people are going to a wide range of different professions and had migrated. But at that point, it was just, their background was farming, or the military.
Excellent. And Dr. Malik, you've really taken ownership of your village and this message and how important it is to, being able to talk about it. So, it's really good that you're doing that work. And but do you feel that enough is said still?
Over the years, things have improved, but like we found out in the news last week, there are lots of hidden histories, undiscovered stories, and lots of injustice and racial prejudice as well. So there was lots of negative aspects to this history as well. But it was the documentary presented by David Lammy MP in November 2019 on Channel 4, called The Unremembered: Britain's Forgotten War Heroes, that really has, brought this to the front and into the mainstream media, where the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have had to reflect and look back and apologize for mistakes that they and their predecessors, the Imperial War Graves Commission, made 100 years ago. There were massive injustices at that time. And as we saw in the documentary and in the report, particularly African and Indian soldiers were buried in unmarked mass graves, not remembered in any way. Their names weren't documented, no gravestones, no markings at all. And yet the white soldiers, their gravestones were very, very well preserved, and their history is preserved until today. So there was this definite sort of white privilege that came along with wars at that time. And to a certain extent, more subtle racism now as well, that is being broken down, and that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission has had to accept, apologize. And also the government, the Defence Minister himself, Ben Wallace, has apologized on behalf of the government, that we need to move on in a positive way now and remember these soldiers, their names, places where they were buried, so that our communities can move on from this now.
We've got Jahan Mahmood. Jahan, who's a historian in the UK. Jahan, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning.
Morning.
Sorry about the delays.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for joining us. You've extensively looked back in this history. You're a proper historian. You've done lots and lots of work on this for many, many years. You've got your own travelling history museum as well, highlighting this. I just want you to, if I can, to go back to the start so the listeners understand, how did the British Empire get so involved in World War One, and how did the subcontinent, Pakistan or India of the day, or Bangladesh, those countries, how did they get involved, and what happened initially at the start of World War One when this huge contribution was starting to be made?
Well, actually, to be fair, because they were they'd colonized the southern Indian continent. India didn't have a say; it was automatically dragged into the war. So if you were a colony, you really were not allowed to kind of stay out of the war. And the dominions, like for instance Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, still had some say in the matter. And I think it was down to once again, a color issue. So in the First World War, what happens is Britain gets caught up in a very difficult situation on the Western Front. The Western
So can you
Front
just explain that, Jahan? They were caught up in a difficult situation on the Western Front. What you're saying is they were under pressure from the Germans at the time?
Yeah, they were under immense pressure. The German army was better mechanized, it was better trained, it had superior numbers. They'd been planning for a war, and they were actually ready for a war, unlike Britain. And Britain got involved because naturally they thought once they've got to France that the next step is us, so we have to do something about it. So they were losing a lot of soldiers early on, and the war obviously started in August 1914, and they had no choice but to call soldiers of color because there was no other regular army, a trained regular army that had seen any form of combat. And the only other troops that they could call upon was the Indian soldiers. But initially they didn't want to because they were worried if they transported soldiers of color into the Western Front, which is modern-day France and Belgium for our viewers, is that naturally we were fighting against the Germans, a white race. And the worry was if the Indians proved victorious, they may return back to their homeland with that success story and overthrow the white rulers, in this case, the British. So very early on, there was the whole issue around colour, and it was the imperial attitude, I'm afraid.
And they put that to one side because they were under threat of losing. So how did they started recruiting all these people in India? And what happened next?
Okay, well, that's a good question. There was a number of ploys that were used. One was the whole martial race theory, because Britain had a classification system over the people they ruled. So the martial race theory was that these are warrior races, and it wasn't something that they actually introduced. It was already existed from the time of the Mughals and even before that, okay? Because you had invaders come in and literally pick out these warrior races based on their traditions. So Rajputs and Awans and some of the Jat tribes and so forth. So Britain had this idea that you've got warrior races and then you have effeminate races. And it was just a simple categorization of two different groups. You were either warrior-like or you were more led by brawn or by brain. So the ones who were brainier were more effeminate, and they had sense. And then the warriors didn't have much sense, but they had a lot of fight and stamina in them. And the British kind of were a combination of both. And what they did was they played on this. So they got chiefs of particular tribes to buy in, and they made promises to them as well, a certain level of autonomy, that, we'll look after you and so forth. Because really they were after manpower. And for those who actually enlisted, it was largely down to two things. It was either a case of adventure or, hunger. Sometimes maybe a combination of both. So that's what the main motivation was for people to be recruited into the British Indian Army. There were 1.5 million in total. And unfortunately, around 1916, there's a dip in recruitment. And now there is forced recruitment that's taking place. So this idea that the Indian Army is totally voluntary is untrue.
And Jahan, some of these were farmers digging their fields maybe in the beginning of 1914, and then weeks later they find themselves in France in totally different conditions. How did that sort of almost weather conditions, they were used to the sunshine and heat of India, and all of a sudden they're thrusted into the cold of war in France. How did that sort of transition happen?
Well, it didn't pan out very well for them initially because, they dock in September 1914, and, by October, the colds really started to set in. They see action, the first Indians to see action at around 22nd of October 1914, and they didn't have time to climatize. And it wasn't the kind of terrain that they'd been fighting in. The northwest frontier was still somewhat drier, and they were familiar with that area, those that were fighting there. But the vast majority of Indian troops that were coming were, as you stated, coming from the War territories, largely from the Punjab. That was the main nucleus of the British Indian Army. I think around a third of the army, the troops were coming from. And it was difficult for them because they'd come over in their kind of summer tunics, and now they were being readied for war. They were on the front. They didn't have much training except they'd seen in the northwest frontier to begin with. And, you know, we have letters at hand of how difficult it was for them. I mean, it was for that reason that the vast majority that were there were only there for 1 year, and then they were dispatched to different war arenas, primarily the Middle East, which is where the majority of Indians would face the Ottoman army, which didn't pan out well for Muslim soldiers in particular.
Yeah, but what, you know, obviously they felt the cold. They were all of a sudden, it was like a shock to them because they were probably coming in from temperatures that were 30 degrees to something that was more like 5 or 10. And
yeah.
You know, how did they sort of be able to? We struggle sometimes if we travel abroad to get the Indian food. All of a sudden, what was the food? Did they have the cooks? Did they have the backup as well, or was that just not there?
Well, to begin with, they had like canned food, so they were eating canned food out of cans, very similar to British troops. But then, yes, there was, and it has to be said that their dietary rights were respected. So the Hindus obviously couldn't eat beef, and the Muslims couldn't eat pork. So, you know, the dietary the laws really respected, but they didn't want another debacle. Like, for instance, the 1857 Indian Mutiny. The whole reason that mutiny just sparked off a rebellion against the British was because of this fear that a bullet had been greased in pig fat and cow fat. And then we see Indian troops who turn on their British officers. And there were other reasons for that as well. It was tax reforms and pressures on the Indians, a general disrespect, which obviously was, once again, they felt, the Indian troops felt, was that there was a disrespect of their dietary kind of, laws. And they really wanted to avert this. So for that reason, in the First World War, the British paid great attention to detail, ensuring that they don't get a rebellion on the Western Front where they need the Indian soldiers the most.
And did they the Indian soldiers? I know that you're saying October 1914 they landed. Did they help protect the Allied lines against the opposition at that time?
Yeah, so they dock in September in Marseille, the south of France, in September 1914. However, they see action in around 21, 22. It's the Belgian sector of the Western Front. And the first troops that have gone in are actually Muslim troops, believe it or not. 129th Baloch Regiment and 57th Wild Rifles, a combination of two different regiments, soldiers picked out, who literally plug the lines that the Germans are penetrating and breaking through. So the Indians are literally being stuffed in to mend that line, to fix it, to ensure that the Germans don't come through it, and then literally end up surrounding the line from behind. And then the German onslaught would have come from the angle that it was already coming from. So they didn't want to get caught in the middle, and it was really important that they pushed these Indians. And the Indians did remarkably well. The Germans were actually very impressed with the Indian soldiers. At one point, they were like, these guys, they're meant to be lesser than us in color, because the Germans had a very similar outlook on, white superiority. But they were really quite impressed with the Indian soldiers. They were looking to then recruit them. So Britain realized as well, wow, these guys are really putting up a fight. I mean, if you look at David Amis's book on this, which contains the letters of Indian soldiers that have been sent back to their family and relatives, it says that of all the different ethnic groups, the Masood Pathans thrived and reveled where other people literally had lost hope. And these were the Pathans from Waziristan, some of the toughest, wildest, most fearsome Pathan, tribal Pathans. And they did so well that the British thought, well, okay, we need to recruit more Indian soldiers. I think in a period of that year, the first year, 140,000 were taken and dispatched to the Western Front, which is a huge number. And then the rest, the vast majority, were deployed to the Middle East, Palestine, and Africa.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting to hear, because the Germans actually recognised the fact that these troops were so valuable, and they probably had a fear of them, didn't they, afterwards?
Oh yeah, well, I wouldn't say it was a general respect. Like it completely altered their lens on colour and brown and black people being less superior. Naturally, there was a kind of hierarchy to all of this. So you had the white elite at the top, then you had general white people, and then of course you have people from across the dominions who are not quite as amazing and quite out there as the British. And then below that you have the brown races of of India, Middle East, and so forth. And even amongst them you've got categories. And then you've got the poor blacks right at the bottom, who some of them don't even see armed action at all. Like for instance, Caribbean troops were just loitering. They didn't see any armed action, particularly against in Europe against fellow whites. However, Africans did fight in the African campaign. Against even the Germans. But it was largely in the European sector. They didn't have any black soldiers fighting, which of course for black soldiers who'd come over from the Caribbean was a great it was very painful for them to be called over and then not seen action because of racism.
We've got a question coming in. Salam, what does your guest know about the Muslim mutiny in Singapore during World War One? Is that something that you know anything about?
Jahan? That was basically there was a large number amongst them that were Muslims, and it wasn't like that particular group out there it wasn't like they numbered a huge army unit. They were, I think it ran into the hundreds, if not thousands, and they were not well treated by their officers. So when they're told, right, you're being dispatched to the Middle East to fight, and they're like thinking, fight our fellow Muslims after the way you've treated us. Obviously, that kind of triggered a rebellion, and then some of them were executed as a lesson to the rest. And the Middle East campaign was very, very difficult for Muslims because initially they weren't told they were fighting Muslims, because on the battlefront they would hear the adhan and they would question the British officers, saying, "Hold on, are we fighting Muslims?" And they would say, "No, they're mimicking your adhan." But eventually they had to take a grip of the situation. They were worrying if they did find out, then we're in it neck deep now. So we have to let them know. So they were alerted eventually that we're fighting Ottomans. But for those who were caught by the Ottomans, when the Ottomans grabbed them and says, "Do you not know you're fighting, the Caliph's army?" As in the last Sultan, well, he became the last Sultan of the Ottomans. Do you not realize? And they said, "Well, no, this is not what we were informed on." So naturally, it came as a great kind of shock to Indian troops, Muslim troops. Some Muslim troops were known to walk all the way back. So Britons in particular, because their area wasn't under British jurisdiction, they weren't really in fear of court-martial. Is that some of them walked all the way from Iraq back to their northwest frontier areas, whereas the Punjabi soldiers had no choice. If they were to walk back and go back to their villages, they would definitely be court-martialed. So it was difficult for Muslim soldiers, very difficult.
We're going to be going for a break in a minute or two. I just wanted to, and then we're going to catch up after the break, and then we'll discuss the wider sort of implications, especially after this week's revelations and what's been going on. But Jahan, do you think that the British would have been able to fight off the Germans and the other soldiers had it not been for the Commonwealth troops at that time in World War One?
Well, that is a question that I've often asked. And, there's only two words for that: hell no. There's just no way Britain would have made it. No chance whatsoever. Yeah. They were getting absolutely smashed and pulverized on the Western Front. To the point that they're forced to recruit soldiers that they saw less than them. That actually explains and defines the entire kind of situation they're caught in. So, of course, no, they would have crumbled completely. Had they not had the soldiers of colour and the Dominion soldiers, they would have just been absolutely thrashed and flushed. So, I know that the Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian, the armed forces in the Second World War said Britain wouldn't have made it without the Indian Army in both the world wars.
We're going to be joining Jahan Mahmood and Dr. Irfan Malik after the break. You're listening to Radio Ramadan 87.9 FM. If you have any messages, please text us on 0777 488 55055. Go for a break, Jahan. Ramadan. You're listening to 87.9 FM. If you've got any comments to this show, we're talking about the Commonwealth contribution in World War One, World War Two, and how the people from across the world came and helped in the war effort in both those two wars. The text number to contact us on is 0774 8855 055, and our telephone number, unfortunately I think we've got some guests on the phone already, so but please send us a text message or WhatsApp message on 077 488 55055. If you've got any questions or you'd like to make any comments, please do that. We've got our guests, both Dr. Arfan Malik and Jahan Mahmood, who's a historian. Thank you for both of you being on. Jahan, we were talking about the war contribution in World War One just before the break, and there was a significant contribution in World War Two as well. And was that of a similar sort of nature to World War One, or was there some slight differences to the contribution that soldiers from the subcontinent made in World War Two?
Well, more countries are involved. Armies they've learned more lessons from the First World War. They've improved their recruitment kind of methods. And the Second World War is now literally empires, like bigger, stronger, more, better trained, better resourced. So the Indian Army from World War One goes from approximately 1.5 million to 2.5 million in the Second World War. So, a massive contribution. And I think the other thing that the viewers should be made aware of is the substantial cost of the Indian economy. This wasn't Britain paying for its own war. The Indians were paying. And in the First World War, the war cost the Indian taxpayer in total £479 million, right? In the Second World War, it ran into billions. So, that really kind of more or less, I don't think you can understate those figures and the manpower that is involved in both these world wars. And unfortunately, this contribution has not been recognized, as my colleague Dr. Malik has emphasized earlier on in the syllabus, in the documentaries. When they play documentaries, like we did the first documentary for Muslim soldiers in the First World War, and it was released in September 2009, and it was played at 11 o'clock on BBC Two. And a number of black historians recently have done documentaries on the Caribbean and African contribution. Once again, the BBC plays at a time when the vast majority of people are asleep. So is it really going to inform people better on what these contributions have been made? And then, then the media want to talk about the lack of integration. If the whole community doesn't even know what we've done and why we're here, we don't know why we're here as well. It was largely because of that imperial link, because of the contribution, the war effort. Is that, of course, integration isn't going to work. And then we're being questioned on why aren't you people integrating properly? I mean, it's actually very thuggish. And, I'm afraid the attitudes of what happened because of this imperial ideology based on racial differences hasn't changed. Because if you look at the memorial to animals in Hyde Park, I mean, it cost a substantial amount of money. If you look at the memorial to coloured soldiers, it's called Memorial Gates. It's more or less diagonally opposite the Buckingham Palace. On a street, in the middle of the street, there are stone pillars with just a few names mentioned on it, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, African countries that have fought for Britain. That is Britain's testimony to the 5 million soldiers of colour that fought in 2 world wars. And the donkey and horse memorial is better looking, more epic than that. And then if you compare the soldiers from the Dominion, there's like individual memorials to the Australians and the New Zealanders, even mentioning names and villages. But there isn't that when it comes to... So what has really changed is the question.
Yeah, but Jahan, this whole thing, the British government this week admitted that they failed, and recognising and commemorating these troops, that there was a differential and everything else, and lots of people from the ethnic minorities ourselves don't know about this history. It's not really instilled in us. Nobody knows of our great-grandfathers or our contributions. Very few people talk about it. I'm just holding up for some of the listeners on on Facebook who can see me. My father was here during the Second World War. He was an air raid warden in Leicester, so he had a war contribution. My uncle, my father's brother, was in India at the time. He was in the Royal Signal Corps. He saw action in Burma. So there's lots of links, but we somehow don't elaborate on them. We don't talk about them, but we should. And that's really the crux of the problem, and being able to make sure that we take ownership of the contribution made.
Well, you see, the thing is, there is definitely a denial and dismissal at the highest level, the government and the media. Like, for instance, I've explained, the media doesn't seem to want to play, the contribution of soldiers of color during the day or at peak time. It just doesn't. I've never seen them do that. Certainly in the last 10 plus years of me being involved in the media. And, you've only got to look at even, Boris Johnson's kind of remarks. I mean, that's all based on an imperial ideology. Like his remarks about black people being like pickaninnies, black people's IQ being low. I mean, we're riddled with this stuff. And there's been a report recently that the government has refused to accept, institutional racism. But this continues because I've already said you've got memorials in Britain today in the last, couple of decades that will swear testimony to animals, but not soldiers of color. What is that telling you? And I know people who actually individually went to the Secretary of Education at the time was Gove, and he refused to put the Commonwealth contribution in the syllabus. So what does that tell you? Not just about the government, but specifically about the Tories.
Yeah, it makes, we need really to take ownership. I mean, Dr. Malik, I'll just bring you in very quickly here if I can. You've taken ownership of your village and your village's contribution, and you go along and do talks and everything else. But is that happening across different places in Pakistan and India, or largely is it forgotten?
I think it's largely forgotten. In India and Pakistan, the remembrance of World War I and World War II contributions is hardly mentioned at all. And I think it may be due to the traumas of partition in 1947 that their history again starts from 1947, and then it just follows a different path. So, I have done, I'm not a historian, I'm not a teacher, but when I saw that there's this huge gap out there of these hidden stories, I try to educate myself as much as possible. And, I wasn't even a public speaker before. I wasn't confident in speaking, but I had to get this message out. And obviously, Jahan's been doing this, as a historian for a very long time. And he's been an inspiration to me and other community researchers who are looking at South Asia. So, we took the ball and tried to run with it ourselves because we realized that schools and politicians and nobody else is going to mention these hidden stories.
Yes, but I mean, Jahan's been an inspiration to people like me as well, and I remember meeting him a few years ago, and really sort of gave me the passion to sort of highlight this. But do you not feel that there's more people from the Asian community should take ownership of what's going on, because that's really vital, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if you talk to anybody of Punjabi or Kashmiri heritage, somebody in their family will have links with the British Indian Army. It's just finding those stories, those narratives, photographs, letters, and empowering people to tell their story. Everybody doesn't have to be a historian, but they can tell their stories of what their ancestors did. There are a couple of projects now in Manchester and in Nottingham. We have a South Asian Heritage Month each year where more and more of these stories are coming out. And it's so important to get these narratives out there and then into the mainstream media as well. And I think all the news that happened last week with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, I think now is our chance to propel and move forward with this and escalate this up, because it's been raised as a huge issue.
Yes, exactly. if anybody's got any messages that they want to send in, our text number is 077 488 55055, and you can also contact us via the telephone, which is 0116 4822 086. We've got another message coming in. Which Muslim military leader and group from World War One, II, or World War II should we learn more about? Which are the people that we should really learn more about? Jahan.
I think for where we are today, World War II is a much better, stronger story. And the reason I'm saying that is it's a very effective narrative. We've got the rise of the far right. We've got racists who, once again, have emerged questioning us, emboldened and questioning us what we're doing here, why we came. And it's because the last few decades they've not been informed either by the government or the media. It's not like the government doesn't know. If you look at Enoch Powell, for instance, and his well-known statement of rivers of blood, this is a man who served in the Second World War and was fully aware of the massive Indian contribution. Yet he still continued with his kind of racial indifference to these different communities who'd come now, seeking to make money for themselves, but also to resurrect a broken economy. And for me, the most effective narrative by and large has been the Second World War. So I've done the First World War. I've trialed and tested it across communities. We've gone into schools with my Shared Histories program. And it's always a bit difficult to say, that Muslims are fighting against fellow Muslims, and also the racist kind of attitudes of the time against also even Sikhs, for instance. There's no Sikh soldiers who won the Victoria Cross in the First World War. There seems to have been some form of prejudice against them. But in the Second World War, we see slowly a greater acceptance, more admiration for the Indians, and British soldiers in particular are learning to communicate, to live and eat, and even die with Indian soldiers on the battlefront. Some of the racial bars are being broken. Indian officers are arguing with the British establishment, saying, you're mistreating these poor guys. They've put up such a good fight for us, and this colour bar has to stop. So, British soldiers are wrecking, and that's a wonderful story for today because, if there's anything that British identity is synonymous with, it's the whole idea of defending the empire from the enemy. And the fact that Indians and black soldiers have played such a gigantic role in the defense of this country is something that, is of great importance to the British public by and large, because there isn't a family here in Britain that hasn't had a relative or an elder that fought either in the First or Second World War. But for them to know that the descendants of the men who fought alongside their forefathers live in this country is such a compelling narrative. And I've been able to change the hearts of so many people. This is why the Shared Histories project, the Second World War one, has been so effective.
We're running out of time. There is lots and lots of war heroes from the subcontinent, lots of VC winners. Look up those Victoria Cross winners from World War II, and you will have some real superb heroes that we can all get behind and really tell the story of. This is Radio Ramadan. You're listening to 87.9 FM. Thank you very much for listening, and please join us next week at 11 o'clock in the morning.